Have you ever felt like the whole world abandoned you? Like you no longer belonged anywhere? In the spring of 1994, Maribeth Colton, 27, heartbroken and alone, left the city behind after being left at the altar. She drove deep into the Trinity Alps of Northern California to an old wooden cabin once owned by her grandmother. No cell phone, no internet. No one knew where she was. And, truthfully, neither did she. But the forest did, because something or someone was watching. Not an animal, not a human. A presence with its own rules, its own reverence, and an unspoken understanding of boundaries. They never spoke. Yet small gestures, a mended fence, a carved stone, a rhythm of knocks on distant trees, told her, "You are not alone here, but you are not unwelcome either. This is not a myth. It's not a movie script. It's a true story, preserved in old ranger notes, whispered through decades of disappearances, and brought to life through one woman's silent, sacred exchange with the unknown." And if you're still watching, maybe you're one of us, the ones who believe that some mysteries are meant to be respected, not solved. Where are you watching this from? How far could this story travel, if we let it? To all of you who feel the forest calling, this is my warmest hello. If this touched something in you, consider liking and subscribing, so we can grow a quiet, kind community of those who still believe Bigfoot isn't just real, but deeply, beautifully gentle. Under the soft hush of early spring, before the trees had fully woken, and before the soil had given up its last breath of winter, Maribeth Colton stood alone on the front porch of her grandmother's old cabin, deep in the Trinity Alps of Northern California. The air was sharp, but not cruel. Moss clung to the stone steps like time itself had grown soft and green. In her hand was a canvas duffel, stained from the road, the kind you never unpack all at once. Her boots were still dusted in the heartbreak she hadn't shaken off since Sacramento. And her eyes, red not from crying, but from refusing to. The sun had already slipped behind the ridgeline when she arrived. The last rays painted the tree trunks in long, amber lines, as if someone had drawn them with trembling fingers. She turned the old key in the door, surprised it still worked, and stepped inside. Everything smelled the same. Old wood, rust, cedar oil. The faint trace of her grandmother's rose soap still clung to the edges of the curtains, though they hadn't been touched in years. The cabin had 3 rooms, not counting the lean-to kitchen. A wood stove, a metal sink, a single light bulb over the kitchen table. The furniture was plain but solid, shaped by hands that had once believed in making things last. It had been silent for too long, but it didn't feel empty. It felt paused. She dropped her bag on the bench and ran her fingers along the window frame. There was a place under the sill where her name had been carved, MB 85. She was 6 when she first stayed here the whole summer, back when her mother was still alive, back when the world still seemed like something that might one day make sense. Now, at 27, she had nothing left but the soft echo of what didn't happen. No wedding, no apologies. Just a key, a road, and the kind of silence that only Old Forest knows how to keep. That night, Maribeth didn't light a fire. She didn't unpack. She simply lay on the old quilt in her grandmother's bed, staring up at the wooden beams. The mattress creaked like it was remembering her weight from another lifetime. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket like a ledge. Outside, the forest breathed without her, and she tried, with everything she had left, to let it. But just past midnight, when the wind had died down and the creek had gone quiet, she heard it. 3 knocks, then nothing, then 3 more from another direction. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a branch falling. It wasn't the house settling. It was deliberate, rhythmic, soft but certain, wood on wood, spaced apart just enough to suggest intention. She held her breath. Another set, closer. It sounded like someone standing at the edge of the tree line was knocking, not on the cabin, but into the forest itself. as if announcing or asking. Her fingers curled tighter around the blanket. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. The knocks weren't threatening, but they weren't random either. They felt aware. Then silence. The creek resumed its whispering. An owl called out, distant and slow. The cabin didn't creak again, and her breath, which she hadn't realized she'd been holding, finally let go. When morning came, light spilled in pale through the east-facing window, casting lines across the wooden floor. She sat up, the chill of dawn still clinging to the air. No messages, no knocks. Just a morning like any other. Almost. She opened the front door to a fog that hung low and blue, catching in the hollows of the hills. Dew sparkled on the porch rail, and there, at the bottom of the steps, laid out in a perfect arc, were 7 round stones, smooth, damp, placed carefully, deliberately, facing her door like a quiet gesture, a handmade offering. She stepped down barefoot, the cold stone biting into her skin. Crouched by the stones, reached out, touched one. It was cold and heavy with night moisture, but there was something unmistakably human about its placement, balanced just so, like someone had taken the time to say something without saying it. She didn't speak, but inside, her ribs loosened. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. She whispered to the morning, barely audible, "I see it." And the wind, for the first time, carried her breath away instead of back at her. She stayed outside for hours, cleaned the porch, walked down to the creek with an empty kettle. The water was biting cold, clear enough to see each pebble below. When she looked up, the trees around her didn't feel like strangers anymore. They stood still, but not indifferent. She had the sense of being observed, not watched, but noticed, as if her presence had been recorded and accepted. Inside, she lit the wood stove, boiled water, made weak coffee from a tin she'd brought. She sat at the table where her grandmother once wrote letters she never sent, the same table where Maribeth once finger-painted with mashed berries while the rain pounded the roof. The silence of the cabin didn't press against her anymore. It breathed with her. That night, there were no knocks, just the creaking of trees in the wind. She slept better than she had in weeks, the kind of sleep that isn't deep but honest, the kind that lets your body rest, even if your mind still has far to go. The third morning, she found a single stone missing from the ark outside. In its place was a pine cone, not a fresh one, an old, grayed one, dried and hollow, split down the middle like it had been opened with care. She picked it up. Inside, tucked between the halves, was a small piece of moss, bright green, soft as breath. She smiled. Actually smiled. It didn't reach her eyes all the way, but it moved something in her chest. Later that day, as she pulled weeds from the garden bed by the porch, trying to bring life back to the old chamomile patch, she spoke aloud. "I never said goodbye," she murmured. To her, to myself. She didn't expect an answer, but later that evening, as the sun fell behind the same ridge it always had, she noticed the fence post that had been leaning all week had been lifted back into place, the wire rehooked, the knot retwisted. She walked up to it, touched it. It was recent. Someone or something had helped her. That night the knocks came again, this time only once. 3 soft strikes, further away, as if from a respectful distance. She stood barefoot at the threshold, wrapped in her grandmother's wool shawl, and listened. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The message was clear. We know you're here. We see how you treat this place. And we'll be watching. When she lay down, sleep came faster. She dreamed of her grandmother's hands braiding sweetgrass, of her mother humming along to an old Glenn Campbell record in the kitchen, of something large and gentle moving through trees, pausing just long enough to notice her. And when she woke, there was nothing outside but frost and birdsong. The stones were gone, but the place they'd been was dry. as if someone had taken care not to disturb the soil beneath. And so she wrote, in the old notebook left by the stove. March 23rd, I came here to disappear, but something out here remembers me. The wind rose that evening, brushing pine needles across the porch like a broom. Somewhere, deep in the trees, something shifted. It wasn't just the forest stretching. It was a presence. Distant, patient. And for the first time in years, she felt something new rise in her chest. Not fear, not hope, but the quiet thrill of being known. And the story, whatever it was, had just begun to speak her name. By the time the fifth morning came, the cabin no longer felt like a stranger's house. The air inside had started to carry her scent again. Laundry soap from a bottle she'd found under the sink, the burnt bitterness of percolator coffee, the rawness of soil still clinging to her jeans. Outside, the trees stood like sentinels, tall and quiet, as if listening to everything and judging nothing. Maribeth had started to talk again, not to anyone in particular, just out loud, like her grandmother used to. Words spilling out like breath when no one's around to hold them in. She talked while pulling up blackberry vines tangled through the side fence, while brushing pine needles off the tin roof with a broom too short for the job, while tugging stubborn moss from the split porch rail. She talked to the plants, to the clouds, to the mud caked on her boots. Some of it was mundane. How many tiles needed replacing, how the water pressure still stuttered in the kitchen sink. But other things, they were heavier. Like how her mom died too young, barely 30, and how her dad didn't even come to the funeral, just mailed a card from Texas with his name scribbled in the corner. Like how she had almost gotten married last week to a man who said all the right things, but still made her feel like furniture. Like how she'd felt herself disappearing every year since college, and how Sacramento never really felt like hers. Out here, the words didn't echo. They settled. Somewhere between the cabin walls and the line of trees, they were received. And the forest replied, not with voices, not with animals appearing in dramatic ways, but in small, precise things, the kind you could miss if you weren't paying attention. One morning, she stepped outside to find that the pile of fallen branches she'd meant to drag away from the well had already been cleared. Another time, after twisting her wrist trying to loosen the rusted cap from the propane tank, she woke to find a large sycamore leaf sitting square in her palm, like it had been placed there while she slept. She kept it, pressed it between the pages of her grandmother's old ledger. The oddest was the patch of ground behind the cabin, where water always pooled after rain. She'd cursed it for years, even as a child, because it turned the back step into a swamp. But one morning, after a heavy night storm, she opened the door and found a narrow channel carved through the grass, perfectly clean, just wide enough for water to drain down toward the creek. Not a mess, not chaos. A quiet fix, like someone had noticed her frustration and decided to help. No footsteps, no tools, just results. She didn't say thank you, not out loud, but she stopped questioning it. Something out here was watching, something old, and whatever it was, it didn't want to hurt her. It just saw her, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. She started spending more time outside the cabin than in. Clearing brush, untangling old barbed wire left from her grandfather's time, restoring the vegetable patch by hand, even though she wasn't sure what she'd grow yet. When she worked, she talked, and not because she was lonely, but because it felt like someone or something was genuinely listening. She spoke of things she hadn't told anyone, like how she never really loved David, the fiancé. How she'd only said yes because she thought saying no would mean starting over. How she sometimes woke up not knowing whose life she was in. How grief wasn't sharp for her, but flat, like a weight she just carried without thinking. How some days she wished she could press stop on everything without anyone noticing. The cabin didn't judge. Neither did the trees. The wind moved gently when she spoke, like a friend brushing hair back from her face. She started feeling rhythms again, waking with the light, sleeping with the dark, eating not because she was supposed to, but because her stomach asked for it. It was a slow re-entry, like her body was remembering how to be human without all the noise. And then came the afternoon she saw the fence had been mended. Not all of it, just one panel, the one behind the shed, where the post had rotted and the wire had sagged for years. She hadn't touched it yet, hadn't even mentioned it aloud. But there it stood, post replaced, wire tightened, as clean a fix as any ranch hand could manage. There was even a smooth rock placed at the base, like a paperweight holding time in place. No footprints, no tools left behind. That night she left a small jar of honey on the back step. No label, no lid, just open, with a folded sprig of thyme on top. In the morning, it was gone. She didn't ask for more, but more came anyway. One day, as she was washing the cabin windows, just because the light was so beautiful through them, she heard something fall on the porch. Not heavy, not sharp, just a gentle thump. She walked out and found a perfectly round pine nut sitting on the mat. Next to it, a strand of dried grass woven into a loop. She didn't touch it, just sat down beside it, waited, and in the stillness, something clicked inside her. Not in her mind, but deeper, like an old rusted key turning in a lock she didn't know she had. She whispered again. But this time, it wasn't just habit. I know you're there. No answer, but no need for one. That night, she left another offering. A small piece of smoked salmon, wrapped in wax paper and placed gently on the edge of the woodpile. She didn't watch, didn't wait, just left it and went to bed. In the morning, it was gone. The wax paper still there, folded like it had been closed again with care. The days started slipping past without names. Monday meant nothing. Tuesday wasn't measured. Time became the shape of light and the sound of frogs near the water. She marked the passing not with calendars, but with sensations. The ache in her legs after fixing the gutter. The softness in her chest after hearing a morning dove sing right at the edge of dawn. But she wasn't alone. Not in the human way, where someone is physically nearby, but in the deeper, older way. Like being in a room and knowing someone else is awake. Like hearing a heartbeat in another room and knowing it's not yours. Something was aware of her, and it was responding, not to her words, but to her actions. When she found an old hammer hanging from a branch just outside her garden gate, the one she had misplaced the day before, it felt like a joke, a gentle one, a reminder. We are watching, and we want you to keep building. She started singing, softly, off-key, songs she hadn't sung since childhood. Her grandmother's songs, no lyrics, just melodies that curved like the river below the hill. The air held her voice like a blanket, and the forest never answered. Not with sound, but with presence, constant, steady, kind. She wrote less in the notebook. Not because she didn't have things to say, but because she had begun saying them to the trees, to the stones, to the wind. And it was enough. By the third week, she'd stopped closing the door all the way at night, left it cracked. Just enough. Not an invitation, a sign of trust. And every morning she checked. Nothing taken, nothing broken. But sometimes, just sometimes, something small would be left behind. A twisted stick, a patch of moss in the shape of a heart. Once, a single raven feather pressed flat against the porch floor. She didn't tell anyone. Who would believe it? Who would understand that the wilderness didn't just have eyes? It had memory. It didn't just watch. It learned. And maybe, if you were honest and soft-spoken enough, it forgave. She whispered once, before bed. I won't leave again without saying goodbye. That night, she dreamed of footsteps in the water. Not splashing, just soft pressure. The ripple of something walking not through, but with the stream. She didn't wake afraid. She woke. Full. Outside, The moon hung low and gold over the trees. The stones near the porch glistened with dew. And for a second, she thought she saw movement, broad, slow, deliberate, between two trunks just past the clearing. A shape. Not shadow. Not animal. Something larger. Something waiting. But she didn't go to the window. Didn't chase it. She simply laid back down, pulled the quilt to her chin, closed her eyes. She had started talking to the woods, and something had started answering back. And even though it had no name she could say aloud, she knew now. She was no longer a guest here. She had been witnessed. And once you've been seen like that, you can't go back to being invisible. Not ever again. Under the slow hush of late spring, when the mornings came soft and gold and the ground was finally warm enough to walk barefoot without flinching, Maribeth began to feel it before she saw it. A shift, not in the trees, not in the wind, but in herself. Something subtle and old, like a bell only she could hear, buried somewhere between her ribs and the back of her neck. It came one afternoon as she was hanging damp towels on the line. The sun stretched long across the clearing, light catching in the threads of her flannel like ash floating in water. Her hands were moving, but her mind wasn't. Not really. She was listening, not for something specific, just listening. The woods were still, not dead quiet, but thoughtful, like they were holding a breath. Then, as she reached to clip the last corner of the towel, she felt it. That thing people don't have a name for. Like eyes on the back of your neck. Like standing in a room that was empty a moment ago and knowing it no longer is. She didn't freeze. She just stood straighter. Let the air move around her, and that's when she saw him. Between two redwoods, maybe 30 feet out, where the clearing blurred into the shade of the tree line, something stepped forward. Not a deer, not a bear, not any of the familiar silhouettes her body had learned to recognize these past few weeks. This one was vertical, tall, broad through the shoulders. It moved not like a predator, but like a man who already knew he belonged. The light caught half of him, shoulder, arm, part of the face, but the rest stayed in shadow. He was massive, easily over 8 feet, with thick, dark fur clinging to a frame too upright to mistake. His arms hung low but not limp, his back straight. There was no hunch, no skulking, only presence. And in that split second, Maribeth's chest didn't tighten. It opened. He didn't move closer, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching her, and she, foolishly, instinctively, watched back. Their eyes met. It wasn't like looking at an animal. It wasn't even like looking at another person. It was like meeting a mirror in the middle of nowhere and finding out it had been watching you long before you stepped in front of it. His face, partly in shadow, had shape, structure. The fur across his cheeks was thin enough to show the slope of bone, the curve of skin beneath. His nose broad and flat, his brow heavy but not without softness. And then the eyes, amber and alive, set deep like lanterns in a cave, stared through her, not at her. He didn't blink. She didn't scream, didn't back up. Somewhere inside, her body had already decided this wasn't danger. It was something else entirely. He stood there for only a few seconds. Then, like fog folding back into the trees, he turned and stepped behind the rightmost redwood, and vanished. No sound, no cracking branches, no rustling, just absence. She stayed still for what felt like minutes, her arms cold now without the towel in them, breath slowly returning to its rhythm. She looked around the clearing, looked back at the trees. Nothing. Not even the usual shift of birds overhead. Later, when she tried to write it down, she realized she couldn't. Not really. How do you explain the feeling of being seen and not judged? Of being recognized by something that shouldn't understand you but clearly, deeply does? Back inside, she poured herself coffee though she wasn't cold. Held the mug in both hands, knuckles white. sat on the floor next to the hearth and didn't move. Her heart had slowed, but something inside her was thrumming like the ground before a train passes through. Not fear, not awe. Something else. Something older than language. She stayed awake late that night. Candle lit on the kitchen table, door unlocked, windows cracked to let the night in. No knocks came. No sign that he or they would return. But she knew the line had been crossed now. Not in a bad way. Not a violation. Just a shift in ground rules. Before, they had remained invisible. Now, they had chosen to be seen. The next morning, she went out to the place where he'd stood. Traced it with her eyes. Found nothing. No prints. No crushed underbrush. Just air and light and quiet. Still, she walked to the space between the two trees, stood exactly where he'd been, turned toward the cabin. From here she could see her clothesline, the porch swing, the edge of the chimney. It wasn't the best vantage point, but it was enough. He hadn't needed to study her. He'd already known. On the way back, she spotted something tucked into the crook of the blackberry bushes, just barely visible. A branch, bent into a rough curve, with two smaller sticks lashed across the center, tied with strands of grass. Not art, not decoration, a shape, a symbol. She picked it up, careful not to untangle it. Felt its weight, balanced, not random. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was left for her. Not dropped, placed. She brought it inside, set it on the mantel, not as a trophy, as acknowledgement. The days that followed passed slower. Every time she stepped outside, her eyes swept the trees without meaning to. Not out of paranoia, but out of hope. She began to hum more. Songs without words, sometimes lullabies, sometimes nothing at all. She left fruit on the edge of the clearing, apples, once a banana gone too soft. She never saw who took them, but by morning, they were always gone. The leaves beneath always disturbed, as if something large had knelt. And still, the forest held its silence. But it wasn't empty. It was listening. Always listening. One dusk, while gathering firewood, she paused to tie her bootlace. When she stood up, her eyes landed on the same stretch of trees where she'd first seen him. And for a flicker, less than a second, she saw movement again. Not full-bodied, just the shoulder. A hint of dark fur sliding behind a tree trunk. She didn't follow, just stood still, heartbeat climbing again. She whispered, not knowing why. "Thank you." The forest didn't move, but the wind did. A sudden, gentle gust curling around her like breath. And then stillness again. That night, she dreamed she was standing at the edge of a frozen lake, barefoot in snow, and something enormous stood behind her, handless but warm, just watching. When she turned in the dream, she didn't see a face, just the shape of comfort. She woke with tears on her face and didn't wipe them away. The next few mornings, she walked further into the woods than usual, not chasing anything, just allowing herself to be nearer. Not every day brought a sign, but once she found a pine cone cracked open, hollowed out, and filled with 5 perfectly round stones. Another time, a line of twigs laid out in a curve at the edge of her garden, just where the wild met the tended. She left a folded scarf on a stump in response, her grandmother's, hand-stitched. When she checked 2 days later, it was gone. In its place, a strip of bark smoothed clean, a single line scratched down its middle like a silent exhale. Whatever boundary had once been there was no longer fixed. They knew her now, and she knew them. Not their names, not their faces, but something deeper. A rhythm, a code, a quiet respect. She wondered if this had happened to her grandmother too. If maybe, all those long summers Maribeth stayed here as a child, the woman humming on the porch, setting bread out for the birds, had been doing more than just living alone. Maybe she'd been part of something older. Something passed down not in words, but in gestures. Maybe she hadn't been alone at all. By early June, the mornings had grown longer. The light stretched earlier, pink through the mist, and the ground steamed gently at dawn. Maribeth began each day barefoot, walking the perimeter of the cabin, brushing pine needles off the railing, whispering greetings to the air without thinking about it. She was part of something now, not claimed, not owned, but understood. And once you've seen a face like that, half-shadowed in forest light, amber-eyed and still as prayer, you don't look at the world the same way again. You move a little slower. You speak a little softer. You begin to watch how your feet land on the soil, how your breath leaves your chest, how much noise you make when you enter a space, because something out there hears it all and chooses, in its own time, whether or not to answer. And when it does so not with words, but with presence, and that presence, once felt, never leaves. Under the simmering heat of late June, the forest had begun to shift again, not in sound, not in rhythm, but in presence. The kind of shift that doesn't show up all at once, but creeps in slowly, like rot beneath the floorboards, or a voice starting to speak from the back of your mind. The days had grown longer, the light sharper, the shadows pulling tighter beneath the trees. Maribeth felt it before she named it. A faint pressure in the air, a hum beneath the birdsong, like something was watching, but this time, not with curiosity. She hadn't left the property in nearly a month. No need to. Everything she needed, the cabin had. And everything she didn't, the forest provided in some quiet way. But on the first Thursday of July, she realized she was down to her last can of coffee. The real kind. Ground. Not instant. Her grandmother would have scoffed at the thought of needing it. But for Maribeth, it was more ritual than necessity. Something to mark the mornings, something to hold in both hands. So she pulled on her boots, brushed the dirt from her knees, and drove down the narrow gravel road into town, the tires slipping once on the mossy corner near the ravine. It was nearly noon by the time she stepped into the general store. The bell above the door gave its usual defeated jangle, the kind that sounded more like a warning than a greeting. It smelled like tobacco, melted plastic, and sunscreen. The shelves leaned in strange directions. The freezer hummed like it was too tired to die. That's when she saw him, Craig Durning, leaning against the counter like he owned the air around him. Tall, late 30s maybe, but roughened by sun and ego. Broad chest under a camo t-shirt, sleeves tight over arms he clearly wanted people to notice. He had that look some men get in small towns, like their boots belonged more to the dirt than their words ever did. The kind that asked too many questions and never really listened to the answers. He looked up from a bag of beef jerky and grinned. "Well, I'll be damned. You're the Colton girl, aren't you?" Maribeth nodded once, kept her expression still. "Maribeth." "Right," he said, stepping forward. "Heard you came back up the hill. Didn't believe it till now. That old place still standing?" She gave a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It is." He leaned in a bit. "Out there all by yourself?" The question hung in the air like smoke. She didn't answer, just turned toward the back wall where the coffee sat. He followed. "I used to help your grandpa haul logs from up there when I was a kid," he said, too casually. "Place always gave me the creeps. Deep woods, no cell signal, no neighbors. You got any dogs?" "No." "Gun?" She paused, turned slowly. "Why?" He shrugged, smirking. "Just saying. You never know what's out there." Her jaw tightened. "I do know what's out there, and it's not the people I worry about." He laughed, a dry bark. "Well, maybe you should." She paid for her coffee and a tin of kerosene wick, nodded once to the clerk, and walked out without another word. But his eyes stayed on her all the way to the truck. She felt them like grease on the back of her neck. That night the forest changed again. It didn't say anything with words, but the messages came in a new rhythm. The wood knocks, once measured and gentle, now came quicker, louder, closer to the cabin's edge. Not frantic, not angry. but urgent. She stood on the porch just after dark, lantern in hand, listening. One knock to the east, then two behind the garden shed, then three from the lower ridge. She turned in a slow circle. Counted them all. They were warning her. Someone else was here. Something human. The woods had let her in weeks ago, but now they were closing ranks, protecting themselves. Or her. Maybe both. She didn't sleep that night. Sat up by the wood stove, kettle warm, windows cracked. She didn't light the outside lantern. Let the dark come close. Let her ears do the seeing. Just past midnight, she heard it. A car engine, faint and struggling, moving slow over gravel. Far off, but real. Not a ranger, not delivery. Too late, too cautious. She waited. It never got closer, just circled, then vanished. The next morning, the southern path behind her cabin, the one that hadn't been touched in years, had new marks. Not deep, but present. One scuff, one cigarette butt, one piece of rope, left tangled in a bush. She picked it up, stared at it. Then she went inside and pulled out the old bucket of nails. By noon, she'd barred the lower shed, locked the cellar, and reinforced the back window with a wooden beam across the sill. She didn't feel fear. Not exactly. She felt something sharper. Older. Like she was being asked to defend something more than herself. That night she left nothing on the porch. She just waited. The knocks came again. 3 sharp, 1 low and long. Then silence. Then the sound of something large brushing along the western fence line. Not close enough to see. But there, moving with intention, like a body built for the dark. She stepped outside once, barefoot, wrapped in her grandmother's old shawl. The air was thick. The trees didn't move, but she felt them shift, just slightly, as if leaning in. She whispered, "I know, I saw him." A breath of wind slipped down the slope. Cold. Fast. Then silence. The next morning the message was clear. At the base of the porch steps, where she often left offerings, there were new markings. 5 stones in a line. One slightly turned toward the cabin. One laid flat and cracked clean down the center. One missing, one smudged with ash. It was a code. She didn't know the language, but she felt the meaning. Someone had entered a space that wasn't theirs, and the forest was choosing sides. She didn't go into town again, didn't answer the knock at her mailbox 2 days later, didn't return the voicemail someone left about just checking on her, in that sing-song tone that always carried an edge. Instead, she stayed quiet, moved slower, repaired what she could, kept her steps light, her voice low, her fire small. She wasn't hiding. She was honoring something that had kept her safe before she even knew it was there. But the human world didn't back down easy. Late one night, just past 2 a.m., a gunshot cracked through the trees like bone snapping under weight. Far off. Not aimed, but loud enough to startle the owls, to freeze the frogs mid-song. The kind of sound made by someone trying to scare, not hit. Someone who wanted to be heard. Maybe by her. Maybe by them. She didn't move. Didn't turn on lights. Just whispered soft as moss. "They know you're here now." And the forest held its breath with her. By dawn, the wind had shifted, blowing west to east. The trees creaked low like a choir too tired to rise. And something in her chest clicked. This was no longer about her being alone. This was about what she'd stepped into. What she'd been accepted by. What had shown itself once on a golden afternoon. And now waited, somewhere in the dark, to see what kind of human she would be when the line got crossed. The town had crept closer, and the woods had drawn a boundary, but boundaries meant nothing to those who never believed the land had a soul. Not yet, and the knocking hadn't stopped. It was just getting closer, louder, smarter, and now it wasn't just a language, it was a warning, and one way or another, someone was going to ignore it. Under a heavy sky, thick with the weight of August heat, the morning unfolded with a kind of silence that didn't feel natural. Not like the usual quiet of Trinity woods. where the hush came from reverence and leaf-filtered light. No, this silence was tight, pressurized, like something waiting to break. Maribeth stepped out onto the porch with her coffee in one hand and a small ache behind her eyes she couldn't name. The birds weren't singing. Even the creek seemed to be holding its breath. She scanned the clearing. Nothing unusual. Just the ripple of heat rising from the stone path, the garden wilting a little from the dry stretch. But her spine didn't settle, and then she saw it. Just beyond the edge of the blackberry bushes, down by the spring-fed trickle that fed the hollow, a sharp glint caught the light. Out of place. Too clean. She set her mug down on the porch rail and walked toward it barefoot, heart already knowing what she hadn't admitted yet. It was a steel trap. Fresh, shiny, mechanically aggressive in the way nothing natural ever is. Half buried beneath leaves, but still visible if you knew where to look. And she did. Maribeth crouched slowly. Her breath burned in her chest. She didn't touch it right away. She just looked. Not a hunter's snare, not the kind made from rope or twine. This was a body-breaking trap. Illegal up here, left open, teeth wide. The kind that didn't discriminate between a fox or a bear or a child. She reached for the thick branch she'd been using as a walking stick, slid it through the jaws, and pressed down. Hard. With a loud, metallic snap, the trap clamped shut on the wood with the kind of violence that made her stomach turn. She pried it loose, slipped it into a rusted bucket, and carried it back up to the cabin without a word. That afternoon, the forest changed again. Not subtly, not in the ways she'd come to understand. The quiet shifts of energy, the rearranged leaves, the hidden gifts. This was louder, stranger, charged, as if every unseen eye in the woods had turned toward the same point, toward her. She left the bucket out in the open near the porch, the trap still inside it like a severed limb. A warning, or maybe an offering. She didn't know which side she was on anymore. Only that something had crossed a line. At dusk, just before the sun vanished behind the ridge, she found something else. Not left by a human. On the porch, beside the bucket, someone, something, had placed a book. Old, fragile. The kind that should have been dust a decade ago. Its cover curled and water-stained, pages thick with time. She picked it up like it might bite. It didn't belong to her. She knew that instantly. But it had been given. Inside, the handwriting was small, square, deliberate. Ink faded to a brown whisper. It wasn't a diary. Not really. More like scattered notations. Observations. No full names. No emotion. Just dates and brief entries. June 7th, 1962. One gone again near McAlpine Rock. Boots found. No blood. October 14th, 1964. Heard the knocks again. Twice. Same intervals. Didn't answer. May 3rd, 1967. They rearranged the stones. I didn't touch them this time. No explanations. No conclusions. Just pieces. Threads. Each note dated. Each one marked by the same hand. It belonged to someone who'd lived here once, worked these woods. A logger maybe, or ranger. Someone who knew what not to say. And somewhere between the lines, Maribeth felt a map forming. Not of places, but of awareness. Of a presence that had always been here, patient and watchful, far longer than her family ever had. She kept reading into the night, the book propped beside her on the kitchen table, lantern flickering low. The entries stopped after 1971, just ended. No signature, no goodbye, just blank pages from there on out, like whoever wrote it either left suddenly or didn't get the chance. That night the woods didn't knock. They didn't have to. She woke up just after 3 a.m. with the deep, primal knowing that someone was outside, not pacing, not moving, just there, close enough to feel, far enough to remain unseen. She didn't look out the window, just laid there under the quilt, hand pressed against the spot on her chest where her heart wouldn't slow down. She whispered into the dark, I destroyed it. You saw me. The trees outside creaked once, then went still. The next morning, the trap was gone from the bucket. In its place was a single black feather. Long, curved, still warm from the morning sun. She didn't speak the rest of the day. By midweek, the air had changed again. Not in temperature, but in tone. The woods had resumed their rhythm, but it felt different now. Like they were watching not just for her, but for what came next. As if the trust they'd given her wasn't unconditional. It had terms, and someone else had just violated them. Later that evening, she found a second trap. This one mangled, snapped, bent in ways steel shouldn't bend without fire or force. The earth around it churned like something large had dragged it from the creek bed, twisted it in rage, and left it half buried beneath wet leaves. She didn't remove it, didn't touch it. She just stood there, rain starting to fall soft against her shoulders, and let the fear settle into her bones. Not fear of what was out there. Fear of what might happen if the wrong people kept stepping into the wrong places. That night, she sat on the porch for hours. Lantern dark. No fire. Just her breath and the steady drip of water from the eaves. When the knocks returned, they came not from one direction, but from three. North, east, and west. Same rhythm, same intervals, not angry, not welcoming, holding a line. Drawing it again, she whispered into the cold air. I won't cross it. I'll protect it. A wind passed low through the trees, bending the grass without breaking it. But down in the valley, beyond where her eyes could see, something else moved. Something that didn't understand boundaries. Something that carried steel and lies and the kind of hunger that never had to learn how to listen. Maribeth sat still long after the knocks had faded. Her palms pressed flat to her thighs, breath shallow. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. She'd been given something. Not a gift. A responsibility. And come morning, she knew, the forest would be watching not for forgiveness, but for what kind of neighbor she chose to become. And somewhere out there, in the unspoken gap between land and man, the next step had already been made. She just didn't know yet who would be forced to answer for it. Under a sky cracked with dry heat and electric tension, the northern edge of the Trinity Alps sat smoldering in silence. It had been days since the last rain, and the land felt brittle, like bark ready to splinter. Even the birds had grown cautious. The sun hovered lower now in the late September sky, casting everything in a harsh, rust-colored tilt. Maribeth stood barefoot on the cabin porch, kettle in one hand, the other shielding her eyes as she stared northward toward the ridgeline. The air had weight to it, not heavy like fog, but tight, metallic, like something was waiting to snap. It came without fanfare. Just after 3 p.m., the first deep boom rolled across the mountains like a drumbeat from underground. A moment later, the second one hit, sharper, echoing off the western canyons like gunfire muffled in cloth. She didn't have to ask. She knew that sound. Thunder, but not the clean kind. This one was wrong, dry, explosive, like a voice full of static. She dropped the kettle, ran inside, grabbed the transistor radio from the pantry, turned it on, adjusted the dial. Static, then a voice, low and urgent. Lightning strike reported near Quartz Hollow. Spotters confirmed smoke northbound, pushing up toward the old timberline. The ranger station was 30 miles out, maybe more by dirt road. If fire took hold up here, they'd only get to her if the winds were merciful. She didn't panic. She filled 2 5-gallon buckets with creek water, placed them by the back door, gathered the wool blankets from the cedar chest, packed a bag, just in case, but didn't zip it. Then she walked outside, slow and steady, and began laying down her own kind of markers, one at each corner of the cabin. Small things. Stones she'd gathered. A carved piece of bark she hadn't touched since midsummer, the feather, the pine cone. The old, folded scarf. She placed each one like a word in a sentence, quiet and clear. I see you. I remember. I still know the boundary. The air darkened fast, not from cloud, but from smoke. A slow, crawling thing that bled through the trees like spilled ink. It smelled like ash and electricity. She didn't light the lantern, didn't speak, just waited. At sundown, distant engines broke the silence, the low hum of ranger trucks on back roads moving fast. She heard shouting once, men's voices, crackling radios, but it faded again. The ridge was too far, the slope too steep. Then came the knocking, not like before, not at the edge. This time, it came from behind the cabin, then from the creek bed, then again, to the west, faster, closer. She stepped onto the porch, chest tight. The knocks were talking to each other, coordinated, not frantic but alert, as if someone, or something, was organizing. Not for her, for their own. She ran inside, grabbed the last wool blanket and a box of matches, stepped back out and laid them on the porch rail, along with the buckets. Then she turned off every light, closed the door gently, sat by the hearth and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and then she heard it. Footsteps, not human. Heavier, slower, controlled, not crashing. Placed. They stopped at the porch, just out of sight. Then another set came from the tree line behind the garden. Lighter, faster, 3, maybe 4 different locations, all pausing at once. Then she heard it, fabric rustling, metal, the clang of the bucket being touched, then lifted. Then the unmistakable sound of a blanket being unfurled, slowly, like someone trying not to wake a child. And then retreat, not rushed, deliberate. She sat motionless in the dark, tears rolling down her cheek without her realizing. Not from fear, from recognition. They had come not for her, but for each other, and they were helping themselves survive. When she stepped out at dawn, everything was as she'd left it, except the buckets were gone. So were the blankets. But in their place, on the porch rail, was a single river rock, wet, warm from body heat, and split down the middle. Not broken, but clean, like someone had cut it with care. By midday, the air thickened again. The smoke was rolling hard from the north. The radio said the fire was still climbing, creeping over the ridge. Controlled, but unpredictable. They were still monitoring. No word on evacuation. Then came the knock on her cabin door. Sharp, human. She opened it to find Craig Durning, face slick with sweat, rifle slung low, shirt stained with ash. His eyes were wild. He didn't ask. He just pushed past her into the cabin, panting, shaking, his boots leaving streaks of soot on the floorboards. Fire jumped the ravine, he said hoarsely. Flared back west. I lost him. I lost the crew. He dropped the rifle by the couch, hands trembling. I saw something, he said. Back there, between the burn and the ridge. I thought it was a bear, but it wasn't. It stood up, watched me, didn't run. Just looked. She didn't answer, just poured him water, sat down across from him and waited. He drank it in silence, then stared out the window. They were close, he whispered. Whatever they are. That night, she didn't sleep. Neither did Craig. He sat by the door with his back to the wall, the rifle close but untouched. She didn't ask questions. He didn't offer more. The wind outside changed direction again, now moving south to north. A good sign. Maybe. But then came the knocks. Soft, measured, from deep in the woods. Craig stiffened, reached for the rifle. She touched his arm, shook her head. More knocks, this time from the eastern slope. Then silence. Then again, behind the cabin. Craig's eyes darted, his jaw clenched. He stood. They're surrounding us, he said under his breath. They're trying to flush us out. No, she said, they're guiding. He looked at her like she'd lost her mind. What? They're not hunting us. They're drawing a path. He shook his head. That's insane. But then the knocks came again. This time from a line, south to west to north, like a path. She stood, pulled on her coat, picked up the small canvas satchel by the door, turned to him. "You don't have to come. But they're not here for revenge. They're here to save what's left." He hesitated, then followed. They stepped into the night. The air was thick with smoke but breathable. The stars above were veiled, but something brighter guided them. The rhythm of wood against wood, always ahead, always just far enough to keep moving. They followed it down the ridge, past the deadfall, past the spring, past the first stone marker she'd laid months ago. And then, open space, black earth, burned trees, a clearing that hadn't existed before. And in the middle, nothing. Just heat, just silence. Then, movement. From the trees, from the edges, figures, tall, massive, but still. One stepped forward, amber eyes catching the last flicker of firelight from somewhere over the ridge. Craig raised the rifle, but the figure didn't flinch. It only tilted its head, then knocked once against the trunk of the nearest tree. She stepped forward, lowered Craig's rifle slowly, and whispered, "I'm listening." And so was the forest, and so was the fire, and none of them knew yet who would survive the reckoning still coming. Only that something ancient had just chosen mercy again. And this time, it expected someone to do the same. Under a night so black it pressed against the windows like a presence. The smoke had thinned, but the silence hadn't. Maribeth stood in the doorway with a lantern cradled in both hands, her eyes fixed on Craig. He sat slumped in her grandmother's old rocking chair, body covered in soot, the rifle leaning by the wall, untouched. His boots were still wet from the fire line, the laces streaked with ash and mud. He hadn't said a word since they returned from the ridge, just stared at the floor like it owed him something, or like it had taken something he'd never get back. She knew what it meant to carry that look. She'd worn it herself once, sitting alone in the same room after her mother died, after her father disappeared, after the wedding that never happened. It was the look of a person who had just seen the edge of something they weren't supposed to understand, and who couldn't decide whether to step closer or turn away. The knocks hadn't come again, but their absence wasn't comfort. It was consideration, a pause, an invitation for her to act first. Craig broke the silence with a breath like gravel in his throat. "I thought they'd kill me," he muttered, not looking at her. "Whatever the hell they are. I was out there alone. I ran out of water, fire on all sides, and then they found me." She didn't speak, just listened. They didn't run, didn't chase, just watched. One of them was standing in the middle of the trail like a damn statue. 8, 9 feet, easy, face like a... He shook his head, rubbing his eyes. Not animal, not man, something in between. She sat across from him, lit the second lantern, and let the glow fill the corners. He looked up, his voice low now. "I should have died out there." She leaned forward, fingers laced, elbows on her knees. "But you didn't." He nodded slowly, then swallowed hard. "Why?" she answered without hesitation. "Because they knew I would help you." He stared at her like he didn't recognize the room anymore. Outside, the wind picked up. Not strong, but cold. Autumn had started breathing through the trees, sharp at the edges, curling under door frames and around window sills. The fire had moved east, contained now, but the scars still smoked from the slopes. The rangers were gone. So was the smoke crew. But something lingered. Not just the smell of burnt pine and charred moss. Something deeper. The weight of a choice. She stood, pulled the old quilt from the sofa, and placed it around Craig's shoulders. He didn't stop her. Just held it like a child holds a story they're not ready to hear. That night, the woods remained still. But not in retreat. Not in absence. Just waiting. By morning, the ground was cold. Dew clung to the porch steps, and the sky was streaked with the pale gold of fall. Maribeth moved through the house quietly, packed food into a canvas bag, cans, jerky, 2 water flasks. She wrapped a second blanket and left it by the door. Craig was still asleep in the chair, the rifle across his lap now, his face turned toward the window like maybe he thought he'd see one of them again. She didn't wake him. She stepped out into the clearing, boots laced tight, coat buttoned, breath clouding in the cold air. She moved toward the path, not the one that led to town, not the one toward the old highway, the other one. The path that didn't appear on maps, that only revealed itself when the trees decided to show it. And it was there, clean, narrow, curved around the slope like a trail made by memory, not feet. She followed it, down past the spring, past the blackened earth where the fire had clawed and the forest had refused to burn, past the place where she'd once left a scarf and found a pine cone. The land here remembered everything, and it remembered her. Half a mile in, she found it. Not a structure, not a camp, just a place where the trees opened wide, where the light changed color without explanation. In the center, the ground was cleared, soft moss, no undergrowth. And on that moss, resting with care, was the wool blanket she'd left days ago, folded, clean. Next to it, a bucket, her bucket. Inside, the steel trap she had destroyed, repaired, bent back into shape. But beside it, on the moss, was a single broken tooth from the trap's jaw, placed, not dropped, resting like a statement. You gave us back the wound, so we give you back the weapon. What happens next is your choice. She didn't touch it, just crouched beside it, eyes wide, heart steady. She could have cried, could have laughed, could have called out loud into the trees, into the hush of watching things that never blinked. But she didn't. She just bowed her head once, and then she stood and left the trap behind. The walk back to the cabin felt longer. When she returned, Craig was outside, barefoot, holding the feather she'd kept on the windowsill. I saw one last night, he said, without turning. Not close, but enough. She nodded. I didn't tell anyone, he added, back when I set the traps. She said nothing. I thought I could get proof. Be the guy who showed the world what's really out here. Still, she said nothing. I was wrong. She stepped beside him, took the feather gently from his hand and placed it back where it had been. You still have time to do one right thing, she said. He looked at her, eyes red, voice thick. What's that? Leave! He didn't answer. That night the knocks came back. Only one set. 3 beats, slow, from far up the slope. It was for her. She stepped out onto the porch. Alone this time. They weren't angry, not now, but they wanted to know. What kind of mercy would she choose when it wasn't convenient? She stared into the dark trees, where no eyes shone, but all of them were watching. She whispered, He's still a guest. The wind shifted, soft as breath, and then silence. She didn't sleep much that night, and in the morning Craig was gone. No note, no prints, just his pack missing. His boots. The rifle left behind by the door, leaned carefully where she would see it. The forest didn't speak of it again, but it remembered. So did she, and in that remembering, something else settled too. That mercy wasn't weakness. It was the only way to keep the line from becoming a scar. And the forest didn't need to punish. It only needed to know she would never be the reason it had to. And that was enough. For now. The cold came slow that year. Not a sudden frost, not a bitter wind. Just a quiet shift, like the land had decided to pull a blanket over its shoulders and rest. Leaves browned faster than expected, but the sky stayed bright. By mid-October, the air around the cabin felt thinner, like something had been lifted. The smoke was gone. The forest had healed faster than it should have, and Maribeth began waking up with a strange sensation that something had ended, even if she hadn't yet named what. The nights had grown still again, not silent, just settled. The kind of stillness you only get after something wild has passed through and left everything just slightly changed. Craig had been gone nearly 3 weeks. No word, no note, no vehicle spotted along the ridge. But she didn't worry. She knew the difference now between absence and abandonment. Some exits weren't escapes. Some were just quiet reckonings. She figured the forest had let him go the way it once let her return, under the condition that he never spoke of what he didn't understand. Mercy was a line with weight, and Craig had carried it out with him. Maribeth kept busy. The mornings were cool enough for flannel again, the kind her grandmother once folded in stacks beside the hearth. She chopped firewood with methodical rhythm, the axe sinking into dry rounds of pine like memory into soft bark. She cleaned the gutters, patched the leak above the porch, gathered the last roots from the garden bed before frost could claim them. The old routines had returned, but they moved differently now. Not out of survival, out of reverence. One morning near the end of the month, she stepped outside just as the sun cleared the east slope. Her breath clouded for the first time that season. She smiled, tucked her hands into her sleeves, and turned to fetch the kettle. But something stopped her. Just at the edge of the clearing, where the moss met gravel, something was waiting, small, still, perfectly placed. A piece of wood, not fallen, not broken, carved, smooth as a river stone, no longer than her palm, pale and oiled and glinting faintly in the new light. One straight line etched down the center. Nothing else. No symbols, no scratches, no trace of who or what had left it. But she knew. She knelt beside it slowly, fingers cold as she reached out, touched it with the backs first, then gathered it gently like it might vanish. The weight was surprising, dense, almost warm. She stood, held it up to the sky. No message. And yet, everything was said. She carried it inside without a word, set it on the mantel where the feather used to be, where her grandmother once placed a porcelain statue of the Virgin Mary, long since broken and buried in the garden when she was a child. That spot had always held memory, and now it held something else. Not faith, not worship, agreement, the kind made without sound, the kind that passed between people who knew where the line was and chose to honor it without needing praise. That evening, as dusk fell slow through the trees, Maribeth poured herself a cup of tea and stepped outside. The sky was streaked in copper and lilac, clouds thin like brushed ink. She sat on the porch swing, wrapped in an old wool throw, the steam rising from her mug, catching the light like smoke from a sacred fire. The forest didn't speak. It didn't have to. Every branch held memory. Every stone had a story. And somewhere beyond the tree line, she knew they were still there, watching, not to protect her, not to study her, just to witness, to remember that once a line was nearly crossed, and someone chose to step back. She'd asked for nothing in return and received everything. The knocks hadn't come in days, but she didn't miss them. She could still feel their rhythm sometimes in her chest when she laid down at night. That slow and steady thump of wood against wood that had once scared her, then taught her, then welcomed her. She thought about her grandmother more now. The way she used to stand in that same clearing, apron dusted with flour, humming tunelessly as she clipped herbs or scattered seed. How she never told stories about spirits or creatures or strange happenings. But how she also never questioned when things moved without hands, or when animals paused longer than usual at the edge of the garden. Maybe she had known in her way, and maybe that was enough. The forest never gave explanations, only invitations, and only once. Inside, the fire crackled in the stove. Shadows danced across the floorboards like old ghosts rehearsing their steps. Maribeth stood slowly, stretched the ache from her spine, and glanced at the mantel. The carved piece of wood caught the firelight, casting a long shadow behind it. That single straight line down the center looked darker now, deeper. She stepped closer, then smiled, because beside it, just barely touching the edge, was a leaf, bright red, fresh, not from her trees, not from this elevation, a gift, or a reminder that something out there still knew she was listening, that even silence can answer back. She left the leaf where it was, didn't press it, didn't dry it, let it curl and wither the way things are supposed to. That night, she slept with the windows cracked, the cold air whispering along the edges of the quilt like a lullaby hummed by the earth itself. She dreamed of footsteps in snow that hadn't fallen yet, of trees parting without sound, of amber eyes in the dark, not threatening, Not pleading, just present. And when she woke just before dawn, there were no knocks, only birdsong, only light, only the quiet promise of another day where nothing was owed, but everything was remembered. And in that remembering, she finally understood. Some stories don't end. They just stop needing to be told. Sometimes the deepest truths aren't spoken, they're lived. Out there in the quiet, beneath the shadow of trees that have stood longer than any house, deeper than any wound, something ancient still breathes. It doesn't ask for attention. It doesn't demand belief. But it waits. For stillness. For respect. For someone to arrive, not to take, but to witness. And when that someone learns to listen, truly listen, the forest answers, not with words, but with signs, with silence, with the kind of presence that doesn't fill space, but honors it. Because the real boundary in this world isn't between man and beast, or wild and known. It's between arrogance and reverence, between the need to conquer and the courage to coexist. What matters isn't how much you understand, but how gently you choose to stand where understanding ends, and whether you leave space for something else to speak. In this world, there are places where logic runs out and memory begins, where kindness echoes longer than noise, and where the land doesn't forget those who tread softly. Not everything sacred needs to be seen. Not every encounter needs to be proved. Sometimes, the most meaningful connection is the one no one else believes, because it was never about them to begin with. Mercy, too, is a kind of language. Not the kind you read in books, but the kind carved slowly through choices. The kind measured not in words, but in what you choose not to destroy. Mercy doesn't always come easy, but when it's given freely, when it's chosen over fear, over pride, over proof, it becomes a bridge. Quiet, steady, invisible to most, but stronger than anything built by force. And maybe that's the lesson waiting in the places we've forgotten to look. That peace doesn't always come with clarity. That not every mystery is meant to be solved. That there's a different kind of strength in staying, in noticing and holding still even when every instinct tells you to run. The wild has always had its own way of remembering those who choose humility over noise. It watches. It waits, and when it gives back, it does so gently, like the wind through pine needles, or the hush just before rain. In the end, it's not about proving what's real. It's about who you become once you've seen it. And maybe, just maybe, that's the only truth worth carrying. Thank you so much for taking the time to walk this quiet path with us. If this story touched something in you, let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe there are still stories in this world that deserve to be told with heart and respect, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. This community is built on compassion, curiosity, and the power of listening. We're so glad you're here.